Good morning, everyone. We are still gathering speakers here, but we've got most of us. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off the session. Welcome, good morning, and welcome to the second day of the Wand and Will Action Summit and the last day of our Economic Security Week. All throughout October, we are reframing the concept of national security and highlighting some of the key aspects of human security, the priorities that actually impact our safety and keep us safe as a nation. As Congress continues to increase the already bloated Pentagon budget by $25 billion that the administration didn't even ask for, even as we walk away from 20 years of war in Afghanistan and try to tell us that that is in the name of national security, we beg to differ. In the last year and a half, if anything, we have learned it is the security at home and at work that is crucial for a thriving people and a thriving democracy. As the nation works to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, we are reforming the workplace to ensure that we are offering living wages, healthcare, and benefits for workers, while a new approach to the economy will be needed to close the market. The pandemic not only accelerated existing trends in remote work, e-commerce, and automation, it exacerbated existing inequalities in income, gender pay, and worker social class. How can the future of work in a post-pandemic economy ensure working families are free from poverty and afforded full benefits while also providing adequate training and fulfill gaps in workers' skills? Well, we may not have all the answers, but we've got an incredible panel here to help talk us through these questions this morning and hear their perspective on the future of work. I am going to start out introducing the panelists that have been able to join us thus far. I'd like to welcome Shelly Steward, who is a director of the Future of Work Initiative, and Melissa Botea, who's Vice President for Income Security and Child Care Early Learning at the National Women's Law Center. We are expecting a couple of other panelists, and I will introduce them as they are able to jump in here, but let's get started with the group we have. We're going to do a little kind of around the table first, let Shelly and Melissa each speak a little about their work, their organization, and the constituencies they serve, and talk about their vision for the future of work. Once we wrap that up, I've got some questions I'd like to pose the panel, and we very much welcome you as well. So as you listen to this discussion, if there are things that come up for you, please do go ahead and pose those questions in the Q&A section just to the right of your screen. So with that, why don't we say, welcome, Melissa, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks so much for having me. My name is Melissa Botea. I use she, her pronouns. And as Nancy said, I'm the Vice President for Income Security and Child Care and Early Learning at the National Women's Law Center. So a little bit about the National Women's Law Center. We fight for gender justice in the courts, in public policy, and across our society, working on the issues that are central to the lives of women and girls. And we use the law in all of its forms to change culture and to drive the solutions to gender inequity that shape our society, and to break down the barriers that harm all of us, especially women of color, LGBTQ women, people with low incomes. And for nearly 50 years, we've been on the leading edge of every major legal and policy victory for women. A little bit about the work that I do and that I'm excited to talk about today is on childcare, on the child tax credit, on unemployment insurance, on housing, on the very basic ingredients that women and the families who depend on us need to thrive. I think that it's sort of widely recognized at this point that the pandemic laid bare and exacerbated the gender and racial inequities that are at the core of our society, and that it is the unpaid and underpaid work of women of color, in particular care work, that was holding up our country. And now we're sort of at a place where we've seen that and we can't unsee it. And so the question is, what are we going to do? And we are actually, this conference couldn't be better timed. We are in the middle of the fight of our lives right now in Congress for the kinds of investments that could really put us on a different kind of track for women and families, for our communities, for our kids, and for the economy overall, to finally be recognizing that unpaid and underpaid labor that's been undergirding all of us for a long time. So I'm excited to dig deep in there and to interact with you all, hear your questions, and work with you. So I'll pass it over back to Nancy.
Thanks, Melissa. I appreciate that. Looks like we were working to get Hayun and Adam on the screen. Sorry, this is our life these days out here in in the virtual world. But in the meantime, Shelly, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about your organization, your work, and your perspective on this?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nancy. And thank you to our audience for tuning in and being a part of what is shaping up to be a really important and timely conversation. So I direct the Future of Work initiative at the Aspen Institute. And we look at the challenges facing workers and employers today and try to identify possible solutions that will bring us to a more equitable future of work. Work has always had a future, but it's become an increasingly hot topic over the past decade or so. As technological innovation has picked up speed, job quality has continued to decline, and uncertainty has increasingly defined people's lives. So earlier conversations about the quote unquote future of work set out to predict the challenges of the future, looked at where we're now and thought, it must be vastly different then. Let's try to figure this out. Where will the robots be? How many jobs will we lose? But the pandemic has shown us with urgent clarity, really, that the future is happening now. And the way we solve the challenges of today is really going to shape what tomorrow looks like. So where things go from here depends on choices that policymakers, business leaders, workers and their advocates, and others make today. And those challenges that we do face today are themselves rooted in decades and in some cases centuries of history, and especially of racist and sexist structures and policies that have led to unequal opportunities and career pathways for workers in today's labor market. So right now we're seeing the culmination of about 50 years of continually declining job quality, with stagnant wages, declining unionization, although we are seeing an uptake in the last year or so, which I'll touch on, some eroding benefits, really unfair scheduling practices, and limited career pathways for millions of workers. And then as technology increases its pace and influences more and more what occupations make up the labor market, we see this problem poised to really worsen. So 4 out of the 5 occupations with the most new job openings are service and care work with salaries under $30,000 a year. The solution to this is not high-tech digital training programs for people who might be losing jobs in manufacturing, cashier retail, or data entry. Instead, it's really focusing on building worker voice, building worker power, and promoting job quality. Security in today's economy means having a robust safety net, having universal benefits available to everyone, having good jobs with predictable scheduling that allows people to balance different commitments in their lives. And all of this needs to be on a foundation of worker power so that workers can fight what matters most in the context in which they work. So that's a sort of overview of some of the challenges both that the Future of Work initiative addresses, and hopefully that we'll have a bit of a discussion about today as we think about promoting economic security. So looking forward to the conversation to come, and I will hand it back to Nancy.
Oh, thanks, Shelly. That's fantastic. Thank you all for your patience, especially Hayun and Adam. I'm sorry. I know, technical difficulties getting everyone on, but you are with us. We can see you. I would like to introduce you all. Thank you for joining the panel. Hayun Yoon, who is the Senior Policy Director at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Nodding from you on Shelly's comments. So I look forward to hearing from you directly and join the conversation. Also, please welcome Adam Shaw, Director of National Policy at Jobs with Justice. Thank you so much for being with us, Adam. I'd like to give each of you, we started out talking a little bit about the panel itself. I'd love to hear from each of you kind of about yourselves, your organization, and the folks you serve. And we're each taking a little bit of time for that. And then I've got some questions I'll share for all of us to talk about a little bit. So with that, Hayun, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work?
Thank you, Nancy. So my name is Hae Young Yoon. I'm the Senior Policy Director at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So thank you so much for having this very, very timely conversation. And so the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we're a national organization that represents the interests of 2.2 million domestic workers who work as nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers in private homes. As Shelly and Melissa talked about, this is a workforce that is overwhelmingly women. A significant portion are women of color and a significant portion are immigrants, right? And so this is care work, and domestic work is really the sector that Shelly was talking about earlier. And I think that's where I was nodding, that was really experiencing, this is a sector that has been historically excluded from some of the core basic workplace protections, right? In the 1930s, the New Deal was set up, and some of the signature legislation that was passed as a part of the New Deal, including the Fair Labor Standards Act that established the minimum wage floor for all workers. Domestic workers were excluded along with some other workers like farm workers, right? And we know that that exclusion really runs the line along the lines of both race and gender, right? Back in 1930s, basically the domestic workers who worked in the kitchens and the farm workers who worked in the farms were African American Black workers, right? And so they were that exclusion was very much intentional, right? And I think also in terms of care work, it is often and continues to be seen as unpaid household labor that is really carried by women, right? And so the devaluing of the work as work that should not be compensated also shaped the exclusion back then. And I think the legacy of that exclusion continues, right? So even though domestic workers and care workers were included in the 1970s, but only during the Obama years that home care workers, 2.4 million home care workers who provide critical services to people with disabilities and elderly were minimum wage and overtime protections. So decades and decades of legal exclusion, right? And then really very much of a gender stereotypes of who should be doing this work, what is this work, how it should be compensated, really shapes the day-to-day working conditions of care workers and domestic workers in the 21st century. So it is so critical to really think about transforming these jobs into good jobs. So we at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we have a goal into 2030 that every domestic work should be earning living wages with benefits, right? And that is the path that we are working towards, right? And I think we're in a really historical, once in a generational opportunity where the President Biden's Build Back Better agenda includes investment in the care economy to domestic workers, childcare workers, home care workers, right? Really making sure that this investment is connected to raising wages and standards for workers, as well as providing very much needed support and benefits to working families and mothers who've been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. So our vision, our goal in this immediate period is to making sure that as our country is really thinking about recovery out of the pandemic, both as a nation, but as an economy, that we don't leave any woman behind, that every single woman worker, every single working family has to be part of the building of our economic future.
Oh, thank you, Hey Young. If the pandemic has made anything even more obvious to all of us, it is the critical role that caregivers and the women, predominantly the women that fill those roles, are to our economy. Thank you very much for that. Adam, I welcome, and why don't you speak to us a little bit about your work?
Thank you, and it's great to be part of such a distinguished panel, and it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you all. I'm Adam Shaw. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the policy director at Jobs with Justice. Jobs with Justice brings together labor, community, student, faith, and other stakeholders to fight for the empowerment of working people. And we also coordinate a network of about 36 state and local affiliates across the nation in states and localities, both red and blue. I think it's so important to think about economic issues as a national security issue, as this part of the conference is doing. We're at a time when people are recognizing that democracy is certainly a national security issue. And while political democracy does play such an important part in our national security, it's only one part of our democracy. We also need to think about economic democracy. People practice democracy at the voting booth, sure. People have a say over the people who pass their laws, as our attendees knew well. But the laws on the books are only part of what governs our lives. It's more than just legislators who have power over our lives. Our bosses, our landlords, our banks, the people who own these billion and trillion dollar companies, the companies themselves that have this monopoly power that are so powerful over our lives, as our Facebook reckoning is kind of showing, they really have power too. And we have a long history of practicing democracy in those spheres too. We just don't define them as much as democracy. Part of that practice has been unionization. And that is the central way that the United States, Hae Young mentioned the New Deal legislation, that we've been practicing economic democracy. But it's not the only way we practice economic democracy. Anytime as a group go and confront our bosses or confront landlords or confront monopolistic companies, we practice democracy. And the best thing that our laws can do is try to understand that reality, that people are already out there negotiating with the people with power over our lives, and that the laws need to catch up with this reality and catch up with the 21st century economy that we're in. And we actually have a real opportunity right now to do this work. As Hae Young mentioned, the care workers being so important, so people recognizing how important they are in our economy, as Nancy mentioned too. That we have, can you all see me? It says that there's no active speaker. Okay, good. That we have the federal government and our media and our neighbors have been using this term essential workers throughout the pandemic. We've known for all our lives that there are people, often low paid, often women and people of color, who face discrimination, harassment at work, who frankly are abused at work, who are actually essential to our economy. And as has become even clearer to the pandemic, economy is kind of a bloodless phrase. They're actually essential to our very lives. That without essential workers, we wouldn't have food on our tables, and we would have infrastructure that's even more crumbling than it is. But now that the government and media have actually recognized with a label that everyone knows now, essential workers, we need to force our laws to change to redeem the implied promise that's made by labeling people essential workers. If there's no person who's an essential worker, no person in general, but it's become clear with the term essential worker, should have to work without a living wage, should have to work with abuse. And part of this work is happening at the federal level to redeem this promise, while Congress is trying to pass parts of the reconciliation bill, including the Protecting the Right to Organize, the PRO Act, which will help people form unions. I think Shelly alluded to, unions are more popular than they've been in decades, and it's really disproven the right wing's argument that the reason for declines in union membership is unpopularity of unions, people not wanting to be part of unions. Based on how popular unions are, we should have union density quadruple or so the amount, or maybe even more of the amount of people who are in unions right now. But the PRO Act also helps people who aren't trying to form a union to practice economic democracy, to complain to their bosses collectively about low wages, about wage theft, about pay disparity. Anytime that workers take collective action to talk about these core economic issues, or even less core economic issues, such as unethical actions being taken by their companies, they're practicing economic democracies, and they should be protected by our labor law. And it's also happening at the state and local level. The New York State legislators took a very bold step this summer, passing the New York HERO Act, which is a comprehensive health and safety law to respond not only to this pandemic, but to future pandemics and airborne diseases and the like. And along with forcing companies to abide by minimum infectious disease standards, it has a component geared to both protecting working people in the short term and building economic democracy in the long run. Any company with 10 or more people, the workers have the right to demand the creation of an employee-employer committee to address workplace health. This provision acknowledges that the experience working people have about their workplace and their jobs. It also allows working people to practice economic democracy in very, very concretely. And as we know from voting, practicing democracy leads to more democracy. When a person votes in a couple of elections in a row, they're much more likely to spend their life voting regularly in every election. And when working people are treated with respect and dignity by their bosses, when their bosses are required to listen to them, they will demand more economic democracy going forward. And at Jobs with Justice, we're committed to both helping workers in the short term and with each individual problem that needs a resolution, but also building economic democracy, trying to find a way to make economic democracy a component of each of the reforms that is necessary. So thank you all, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with our co-panelists.
Oh, thanks for that, Adam. That's fantastic. You got me with it. I think you said the term essential workers being a bloodless phrase. It was I like that. I like your framing of that a lot. Yeah, I feel there's a lot of lip service given to that, not a lot backing it up often. Okay, well, I'd love to kind of open up, to panel discussion here. I've got a couple of questions that I think I share to think about, and let me throw one out, and I welcome any of you that are kind of inspired to chime in to talk about it. First, I would love to say, when we talk about national security, and Adam, you touched on this a little bit, and Hae-Young, you did as well. National security, most of us think about the way the U.S. Engages militarily with the rest of the world. That's what we think of is soldiers and guns and wars and tanks and things. Our concept of keeping Americans safe is almost exclusively tied to all of that. How do you think about ensuring the safety and security of the American people, of the workers that you advocate for? Can you talk a little bit about that and about how we can reframe that into a concept of national security?
I'm happy to kick off with a few thoughts and really interested in what the rest of the panel has to say. I think one thing that we have to also think about is bodily autonomy when we think about security. Thinking about right to access healthcare, making sure that we are safe from harassment and discrimination, making sure that we have the tools in order to make sure that our families and ourselves are safe on the job. And also that means economically secure and stable. Hae-Young and I work together a lot on these issues of care infrastructure. But when we think about childcare, when we think about paid family and medical leave or home and community-based services and supports, an expanded child tax credit that actually reaches all families, we've for a long time conceived these as personal problems for people to navigate on their own, that somehow if the math for your family isn't adding up, you've done something wrong. When in reality, we've set families up to fail. There's not actually a choice if childcare doesn't exist in your community. There's not actually a choice if you can't afford home care, or if there's not actually a choice for home care workers or childcare providers if they can't make living wages. And so I think that we have to sort of reclaim this idea of security to also encompass stability, bodily autonomy, and the idea that all of us deserve, to have our basic needs met and to have the opportunity to thrive. So those are just a few initial thoughts, but very interested in what others would add.
Yeah, Nancy, thank you, Melissa. Totally agree. And building up on that, I think we often say national security is to advance our national interest. And so I think we do need to interrogate what will get us to advance our national interest, right? And I think it's exactly what Melissa's talking about, that we have to really think about not just individual interests, but a collective interest, right? And I think in some ways the pandemic really, really demonstrated to us. I know some days it doesn't feel that way, but if we can go back to 18 months ago, where we felt like my well-being and my security and my health is inextricably tied to that of others around me, right? And so I think about that of how do we ground security interests in that context, right? And so what does it mean for, for example, a person with disability or child with, who's got complex medical needs and need care and supports in that child's home, right? And that in order for that to happen, a worker who comes to the home to provide that critical support also need to be healthy and well, right? And so much of that is tied to making sure that we have every person who's working our labor market to have family sustaining wages and have the ability to support themselves, right? And have access to their healthcare, right? And so I think if we can think about, as Melissa was saying, like these needs we have as individuals that make up our country isn't just about individual needs, but it's individual needs and collective need. And I think this is something that we continue to work on. And, it's hard is we think about how do we shift the cultural ideas and norms about care responsibilities, families' care burden, isn't just about the individual family's burden and challenges, but that it is about a collective challenge and a collective burden, right? I think if we can begin to shift that, maybe we can think about how do we reframe security interests that is about taking care of everyone. And again, I think it is really about no one should be left behind as we are thinking about building back, right, from this pandemic.
Go ahead, Shelly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so security really provides a foundation for people to have freedom and flourishing, and that's true in the economic context. And we know from guaranteed income pilots, for example, that once people have a basic level of security, once they're not struggling on a day-to-day basis with poverty level wages combined with skyrocketing costs of living, especially housing, and an inability to plan a week out, much less a year out or 5 years out, those people are more likely to be in full-time employment, more likely to seek training opportunities that put them on career pathways to a lifetime of success, more likely to organize with fellow workers, and more likely to contribute to communities. So that baseline level of economic security provided through both public safety net programs, through good jobs with good wages and good benefits, those equip people to participate in the community and to build the collective voice and collective community that we want to see and that our society really needs right now.
Yeah, if I could just add, these are all great points. I know that the environmental community, which has done a really good work of saying climate change is a national security issue and is an international security issue, and that's absolutely true. And economic security and economic fairness is really part of that. It really has the same sort of dynamic, both internationally and domestically. We are at a time when people should be recognizing how endangered our society is, not just from the pandemic, but from the insurrection on January 6th, and that our political democracy we're not in a way where we can, we're at a place where we can be sure our political democracy is going to be surviving and secure within 4 years, let alone 50 years. And part of that is understanding the real dangers that have come to our society from having this huge amount of income insecurity and disparities and disrespect and inability for people to feel not just feels the wrong word, to actually have dignity at work, have safety at work, have the knowledge that they will continue to be able to provide for their families because they're not making a minimum wage, because they can be fired at a moment's notice. And as Hae Young was saying, because it's just an individual fight that they have, a struggle that they don't have collectively with their their neighbors, with their community. It's just a fight that they have every day to have enough food to survive. And we really should be creating a whole alternative to a libertarian school of thought, of a communitarian school of thought, of a way in which we working people are able to have real power. And we have this, we can build the structures to do that. And it's really a matter of security, because our society is in danger of not really surviving in the long run unless we figure this out.
Yeah, boy, those are all fantastic points. I am scribbling so many fantastic quotes out of this conversation. Yeah, it's that kind of concept that somehow when we talk about from a budgetary perspective in Congress, the national, the national security or Pentagon budget, that's a, well, we can't just must have, that's our safety, that's our security. But when we talk about things included in the Build Back Better Act, it's sort of like, well, that's fluffy, soft, extra stuff that. Anyway, we have a lot of women state legislators that participate in our group and that are listening to you all today. And so one of my questions for you are, and these are smart, intelligent, engaged women throughout the country that are obviously care about their communities and working in their states. Can you share any thoughts or ideas on specific recommendations that they can take back to their work in their state legislatures, in their engagement with their communities, about how they can either talk about specific policies or help reframe the conversation as you're talking about it, as we're all talking about it here today, of what really is important to our national security? I think you all will have great ideas in this, and I'd love to hear it. So I leave it open to the table.
So something that Young and I are actually working on together is sort of, if we win something in Build Back Better, I'd like to say when, but I don't want to jinx it. But if we win something in Build Back Better, there will be an inordinate task of implementing it equitably in states, whether that is paid leave or childcare or home and community-based services, whether it's outreach to make sure people are enrolling in the various different things, or the policy choices that states have to make in terms of how they set it up. And one of the principles that drives National Women's Law Center is that women don't live single issue lives. We're not, you pull away one of these things and it has an effect on every other part of a woman's life. And so part of what, honestly, under the leadership of Caring Across Generations and National Domestic Workers Alliance and other partners, we've been thinking about is, how do you talk about all of these things as a care infrastructure in states, so that as we're building systems, we're not reinforcing the silos that have been with us for a long time and have put us in this scarcity mentality of, well, if they move forward with paid leave, then childcare gets left behind. Or if they cut from this, then that means less cuts for my thing. No, like, it's the same woman. It's the same family that needs all of the things. And she and her family need to be able to access them in a way that makes some kind of coordinated sense without having to fill out 1,000 pages of paperwork just to prove that she's eligible. And so the implementation is where the rubber hits the road on a lot of these things. And so really being champions and thought partners across various movements in your state for how the potential for new federal dollars can be implemented in a way that is cross-cutting. And, if you're getting paid leave because you have a new baby, you automatically are getting options for childcare to you. And you're making sure that you're enrolled in the Young Child Tax Credit, so diapers are more easily affordable. Or if you're taking paid leave because you have, a father who had a stroke, that then you are able to access home care so that you can return to work. But all these things integrate across our lives. And so the way we implement this, and hopefully in a way that makes sense and is reducing the barriers and the need to prove deservingness of people, will be a huge role for state legislatures and state governments overall.
Yes, building upon what Melissa said, I want to kind of maybe spend a couple of minutes focusing on how critical it is for state actors, state legislators, state agencies to be part of the implementation as it relates to home and community-based services. So this is Medicaid's home and community-based services funding. This is really at the funding level is a partnership of the federal government and state government, right? So the federal money will go down, but the states need to match it. right, at the funding level. And in terms of the implementation of the program to expand services to those who are on wait list, making sure that the reimbursement for these services provided by care workers, which is essentially the wages of care workers, is very much the providence of the states. They structure the program in such a way to meet the needs of their state residents. So, unfortunately, Medicaid's home and community-based services is very much of a fragmented program across the country because of this partnership and the relationship between the federal government and the state government, right? And in some ways, or in many ways, politics drive how these programs are structured. So in states like California, Massachusetts, Oregon, New York, we have really fantastic programs, right? But in some places, in parts of the country, right, and they tend to track the red states, there's less, right? So a significant portion of 820,000 people who are waiting to receive these services are in 3 states: Texas, Florida, Louisiana, right? So you can see where I'm going with this, right? So I think that we really want to make sure that this fragmentation is addressed, that there is home care is provided in every single zip code, right? That we are not living in a country where there are like pockets of the country that are experiencing home care desert, right? And so I think this is where state legislators, state agencies have a really incredible and important role to play to engage their state leaders, governors, state health and human services agencies, partner with the federal lawmakers to make sure that this implementation happens in the most robust way that is really meeting the stated goals of this program, which is to expand services to those who need it and raising the wages and standards for workers towards building a really durable caregiving system in our country, right? Because at least when you look at home care and home and community-based care, we have an enormous caregiving need we face as a country, right? There's 10,000 people who are turning 65 every day, right? The aging population is, poised to, triple in the next decade or so, right? And so people are going to need some level of care because of the aging. So we want to be ready as a country, right? One of the senators said this remark that which I love, and I say it in everywhere I go, is that we said this investment in the home and community-based services is a right investment in the right people at the right time, so that we as a country are preventing a crisis becoming a catastrophe, right? And so this is where I think the state legislators have a role to play. I think it more generally in terms of, so that's specific to home and community-based services and care economy. I think more generally in terms of thinking about job quality, economic security, economic opportunity, I think you all know that we have a labor and employment system where the federal government establishes the floor and state governments could set higher standards and above. And there's always a momentum and a relationship, right? And I think the raising of the minimum wage at the state and local level is a really good example, right? Who would have thought a few years ago that we would be really getting to 15 as the minimum wage rate, right? And so that kind of momentum for raising wages, improving standards, providing paid leave, paid sick days, all of that is like, if there is momentum at the state level, that really is like a roadmap. And, it's an on-ramp for what could be possible for us to establish national standards. So kind of knowing that relationship, I think, in terms of making sure that we are creating these better standards, better economic opportunity at the state level is really, really important.
And something that I'd add, especially Nancy, thinking about the aspect of your question about how to frame some of these questions, thinking about questions of workplace protections, good jobs, decent wages as absolutely foundational to get people participating and engaged in economic activity, in the labor market, in society, in the full range of ways that that can happen. Something we see with the future of work conversation is it can get sort of bifurcated between a set of conversations about really job quality, and then a set of conversations about training needs, workforce development, a set of issues related to that, to skills, questions of what occupations people are doing. And these are not two separate conversations. People need a basic level of economic security in order to develop skills, in order to participate in on-the-job training or other types of training opportunities. And so when those are brought together and saying, look, having a voice in your workplace, having some worker power facilitates training, facilitates some of the high-tech career pathways that we might hear a lot about, can bring those two conversations together, which needs to happen. And then the other piece that I'd add, building on what Melissa and Hae-Young have said, is about making programs really universal so that all workers can access them, whether they're protections in workplaces, whether they're benefits available to people, safety net benefits. We've thought a bit about how to make sure policies are inclusive. We've talked a bit about how to implement them in ways that they are accessible. And there's also a component of outreach, of making sure that people know that those well-designed and well-implemented policies and programs are out there. And that involves engaging workers and their advocates, making sure that they're part of the design process to make sure that, the implementation may make sense from a policy standpoint, doesn't make sense from the user standpoint, from the participant standpoint. So just one more thought to add to the conversation.
I already mentioned the New York HERO Act. I would say that if you're in a progressive, if you're in a place where there's progressive leadership and you're able to pass something bold, that's one example. California is also taking the lead on things like algorithmic supervision. And Colorado just recently passed an Ag Workers Unionization Act, and so there's definitely things that can be done if you are that really address the 21st century workforce. If you're in a place with progressives, if you're in a place with a strongly conservative government, what I would say, there's really a lot of work that the state legislators in coordination with local governments. If you can have a good relationship with people who have this idea that local governments are so used to being starved with money, and through the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, they got a large chunk of money that people are really surprised at and don't know quite what to do with. And I would say, making sure that money, working with your local government and county government, I think most states, I believe, have allocated the money. And so you might not be able to do that as much at the state level, but all of the cities and counties and towns are getting that money too. And working with them to make sure that money goes to working people, goes to improve the lives of working people, rather than paying off debts, which essentially is just giving the money to Wall Street or other things like that. It's really a powerful thing. And if you can build in, as I said before, a worker advisory board into this, as Shelly was just talking about, getting worker input. If you can do that, if you can build in an economic democracy piece to that, so much the better, because it'll make you stronger for the next fight. And if the local places aren't, it's not a place where you have good relationships, I'd say work with the workforce, with the WIOA workforce boards, that they often have technical expertise and are much more nonpartisan, and try to make sure that they are really working to train people for good jobs and are getting worker input. and all of that. But I do want to again stress the New York HERO Act and the ability to get workers to have the expertise to provide their own health and safety experience to make things better.
Those are all fantastic points, all of you. I really, really appreciate that. Adam, you hit right to my heart on the involving the locals. My career started out in local government, and I hold them near and dear. And it's a brilliant idea. I think it is you tend to move away a little bit from the partisan politics the more local you get, a little more pragmatic, not always, but in a lot of options. So that's great call out there. There are a couple questions I know that some of my colleagues have put. I want to do one more at least that I was thinking about, I think shared with you guys, because I'm really curious to hear your perspective on this. And that is, what are the implications for our nation if we do not shift our thinking and our policies and our national budget to support working people, especially working women and families? I don't want to be like too doom and gloom, but I think it's really worth us really considering. One of you said earlier, I love this. Oh gosh, preventing a crisis from becoming a catastrophe. What's at stake here? What's the reality if we don't take this seriously?
If I could, so when you were asking that question, Nancy, my mind went immediately to what we heard from our members during the early part of the pandemic, right? So again, back 18 months ago, when the shelter in place orders took effect, and you remember those eerie, very quiet, I live in New York City, like very, very quiet, almost to a point like eerie, of everything shutting down. And I had the luxury of working at an organization where I can work from my apartment, have access to paid time off, job security. But our members went through this devastation where 70% of our workers lost their job within days, right? And that, an average annual income of a home care worker last year was 17,000 a year, right? There's some new analysis that shows that there's been a little bit of an increase up to 18,000 a year. Still, that is not a family sustaining wage, right? And so that's the level of, I think, suffering that our folks experience, right? They lost their jobs, and many of them are immigrant workers who already was not able to access any assistance. And, many of them do not have a savings to fall back on. They had no paid time off. And even in cities where they had access to some days of paid time off, right? I think it was just really hard for them to even ask for it, especially in a workplace when you're like one worker against like one or two employers, right? Given the power dynamics. So I think the last 18 months really showed to us in very painful ways the unspeakable amount of harm, suffering that people went through, and that domestic workers, similar to other workers that we deemed as essential during the pandemic, really faced impossible choices, right? They either had to like risk their lives and the safety of their families to go to work to support themselves because they didn't have anything to fall back on, or right, not have any, security, right? And in one of the Zoom meetings that we did with our members, one of our workers showed her phone, her savings account. She literally had 5 cents in her bank account, right? So I end with that in terms of, I think that's what's at stake here. Like, if we don't move forward and really think about lifting everyone and making sure that we're giving everyone that real fair shot at economic security, right?
And the pandemic has highlighted what's been happening for decades, which is the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few, where working people are left behind and are really struggling. And some of what Hyung shared highlights like the devastation that can cause to families, to individuals, to households. But there's real social impacts as well. That concentration of power into the hands of a few runs against democracy. Adams talked about economic democracy. That's against the ideals of this country, what so many of us who work in policy and policy making got into this field to do and to fight for. And so the stakes here are very high. And I'm optimistic seeing the attention that these issues are getting, seeing the actions of workers organizing, unionizing, fighting for change. So I'm optimistic, and I hope that the stakes fall in the direction that we want them to, in favor of working people, in favor of democracy. But what's at stake is a lot.
I'll just add that we've done a lot of work on the costs of inaction. It's not like if we don't do anything that it's there's no consequence. We're talking about even before the pandemic, the economy lost $57 billion a year because of the lack of affordable, high quality childcare. It's just like one example of that. And I think that we've also done a lot of work on what are the benefits if we do invest. So, for example, we did an analysis with Columbia University's Center on the Study of Social Policy that showed that if you invest in high quality, affordable childcare, for example, you see women's labor force participation go up by 17%. For women without a college degree, it's over 30%. You see women make over $100,000 more during their lifetime. You see them more secure in retirement, and you see poverty, the disparity between poverty between men and women close both at childbirth age as well as in retirement, because the gains from that additional wages compound over their lifetime and lead to a more secure retirement. So the opposite of that is what is at stake. And so I think, to the points made by Shelly and Adam as well, this is also kind of a make it or break it moment for democracy, because for a really long time, we've been taught not to trust government. And I understand why people were hesitant to trust government, because it was giving big tax cuts to the wealthy and corporations, allowing them to pollute, allowing them to strike trade deals that, and allow for a misclassification of workers. Workers weren't protected in many ways. But when the pandemic hit, who did we turn to? We turned to our government. We turned to our government to distribute vaccines. We turned to our government to make sure that there were safe stay-at-home orders. We turned to our government for public benefits like unemployment insurance, even as we had uninvested from the infrastructure needed to administer it for decades. And so people have been turning to their government during this crisis, and this is a chance to say, we heard, we saw. And we're actually going to make these investments. And not to be a doomsday person, but if we can't make these investments, if we can't figure out a way to respond to the primal scream of mothers and caregivers and others across the country, there's a risk that people lose that faith in government again, that once in a generation opportunity to show that we can make things work for people. And the consequences of that, in terms of descending into like a populism that is Trumpian, as opposed to a populism grounded in worker power, is very dangerous.
I'm optimistic too. One of the things to think about is that we've, as a country, voted for the last 30 years, a majority of us, when we've had presidential elections, except for once, and that was at a time of war and a terrorist attack, for the more progressive option. And so we should be bold. And so we shouldn't be scared. We have this feeling that people are against us, and we saw from Biden running such a progressive campaign, as opposed to maybe his history, that really progressivism is popular and is a winning option. And so I would just urge people to be bold, because everyone says the stakes are really high. And I talked a little bit about the insurrection and all, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But that we can do it, and we're not going to lose government to the Trumpian populists, as Melissa just said, if we be bold. But now is the time to be bold. Everything else.
guys are just incredible. I love that you took a little bit of a doom and gloom question and turned it into something hopeful. That just brings great joy to my heart. I want to thank you all. I could have this conversation for the rest of the day. Each of you have been so inspiring to me. Like I said, I've taken so many notes for myself. I want to thank you, Melissa, Shelly, Hyung, and Adam. I really, really appreciate your time here today with us. I know our legislators will be absolutely thrilled to continue this conversation going forward. You've given us a lot to sink our teeth into.